The story you've seen in previous podcasts comes down to this point here where December 2004, a mysterious man turns up threatening me that my research is upsetting the most powerful Israeli businessman and all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. An amazing claim because he contacted the TV station SBS TV, who had aired a program about my evidence that my research companies and encryption companies had been defrauded by the directors of Johns Hopkins University. Given the claims that he was making, he represented CIA mafia in Australia during the Guggenheim Bank era, and that I'm upsetting some powerful Israeli businessmen. I had no idea who he's talking about, as my TV program, I thought, was not related to anything he's talking about. However, it was related to the fact that I was investigating the PROMIS software. The investigation that I'm doing now is the evidence that I uncovered when William Hamilton contacted me, advising that our research into the PROMIS software was upsetting the neocons, and that Paul Wolfowitz was leading the efforts to undermine and shut down all of our research into the PROMIS software. So let's begin the story. 4 weeks later, a press release. President George Bush Jr. announces that he's going to appoint the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, to become the next president of the World Bank. As I said to you, the mysterious man that appeared in Australia threatening me was Robert Booth Nichols. I've indicated that in previous podcasts, and that this was his summary. I'm upsetting some very powerful Israeli businessmen. I'm going to get a crowbar to the back of the head if I don't stop. If I still continue with my investigations, then I'll have the military coming down on me. And then I'm advised by William Hamilton in February 2005 that Paul Wolfowitz is leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby to shut down my research into the PROMIS software. So how can these things be connected? And why me? Well, in previous podcasts, if you watch all previous ones, you'll get to one where it talks about that I uncover the fact that I was working for Rupert Murdoch's company called Computer Power Group, who was developing all of the CIA Safe software, which was integrated into the Swift banking software network with their partner WANG Labs, Charlie Cross, Ted Prince. Charlie Cross was coming to Australia working on a biggest fraud detection with Social Security and Department of Social Security, and also installed into AUSTRAC for tracking all money transactions over 10,000 at banks in Australia. You can watch those podcasts, it's very detailed, but the partnership was forged between WANG Labs, Hadron Inc. and Simcom Inc., together with Rupert Murdoch's company, the Australian company with expertise in cobalt compiler technologies, artificial intelligence, which is essential, and also they have artificial intelligence text retrieval systems, which is integrated into CIA Safe software, and also into the Swift banking software system with WANG Labs. It was installed in all the banks worldwide and also casinos. The common investor was Stanley Schumann, representing Allen & Co. He was an investor in Earl Bryan and Rupert Murdoch media barons who are working with CIA with their Project Democracy and propaganda program to disguise the truth about everything about Iran-Contra and all covert black operations of CIA. They shut down and paraphrase a narrative that keeps the public dumb. Most important thing is that Allen & Co. own Resorts International casinos in Las Vegas and also in the Bahamas, and its links are directly with Mayor Lansky former Israeli mafia links for the biggest money laundering operations with the CIA and OSS and Mossad. I've proven beyond doubt that they developed it for CIA, DIA, NSA, and also with NROL, and it's actually echelon, economic espionage, and also used for dual purpose, tracking Soviet submarines and missiles, and also the database has the ability to integrate all the intelligence databases. So this was a pet project of William Casey, and I'll demonstrate that to you. But what's this all about? How can I upset the neocons? Well, I'd uncovered evidence that the CIA safe Swift banking software was being commercialized. Yes, CIA, DIA, with Barry Kelly and Lee Feldman from DIA, plus also Paul Boker from US State Department, who used to work for, yes, you guessed it, Henry Kissinger, together with Robert Gray, who are the investors behind a company called Iris Corp. It's launched in 1981, 1982 and 83 and shuts down due to a dispute and goes bankrupt. Gets into a real business mess, but the truth was uncovered by me. Head of it was Robert McNamara. You may know him as the former president of the World Bank. Edward Heath, former Prime Minister of the UK. These two identities are very important because they overlap with Pentagon. The papers that Daniel Sheehan had exposed, the Pentagon Papers, in terms of the war in Vietnam. But most important, it's intelligence of Pentagon to be able to track all financial transactions of Soviet Union and China and all other countries worldwide, where they can actually monitor their purchase of technologies, particularly in nuclear technologies, dual-purpose technologies of computers, but more importantly, infiltrating all banks worldwide. So you will love this. It's called economic espionage. It really is echelon. They have two purposes: tracking all nuclear missiles of Russia and China and any other country trying to acquire it, with Pine Gap in Australia. And what's really unique about this is that Inslaw's software was the critical component. Its ability to integrate distributed databases from multi-vendors seamlessly. That's all it was. They needed something that could integrate all of the intelligence databases, DIA, CIA, NSA, NRO, and all justice systems, any form of intelligence for justice, FBI, and also in Secret Service, and also across all areas of customs. It's very good if you're doing something good, but if you've got an octopus that is actually money laundering, drugs, arms, gold bullion, to fund covert off-the-book activities. This is where Robert Gray comes in and Henry Kissinger. So I want to dedicate this podcast. It's my research over 21 years, following all of my revelations to show that Rupert Murdoch's and Earl Bryan's companies were the ones that developed CIA Safe, and also the CIA Safe Swift banking software that was installed in all banks worldwide. I'd like to dedicate it to Danny. He was going down to meet a source. He had all of the evidence from NSA that was looking at financial transactions of the sales of software to World Bank and banks worldwide, with Earl Bryan and Richard Secord through their companies registered in Cayman Islands and Switzerland. And he was going down to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman, who was reluctantly meeting with him because Danny had the damaging evidence that showed that BCCI had financed Iran-Contra, and Danny was hoping he could traded for evidence relating to the PROMIS software. Unfortunately for Danny, it was the same octopus. They were involved in everything: October Surprise, Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of the PROMIS software. So Danny was investigating the dismissal of Gough Whitlam in Australia, Nugan Bank in Australia, October Surprise, the Wackenhut, Cabazon and casinos and arms, links with CIA and the Gambino Mafia. I'll do a whole podcast on that. Fidco, together with all of the links with Robert Booth Nichols, Robert Mayhew, George Pender, with Mafia, Yakuza, Medellin Cartel, intelligence and drugs and arms. The Costigan Royal Commission in Australia, with the evidence that Danny had about drugs, arms and money laundering involving Nugan Bank, and also the Painters and Dockers Union, which was part of the inquiry with money laundering with Robert Booth Nichols. BCCI, he had the checks. Iran-Contra arms and drugs, evidence of the payments through BCCI. More importantly, he had a memo, a secret memo, implicating Oliver North with his links with the drug contacts of Noriega, together with French intelligence, Mossad, CIA front companies in Singapore, selling $2.5 billion of arms to Iran and Iraq. Indochina report, which detailed the links of Earl Bryan, together with Robert Gray, together with Mossad agent Solomon Schwartz, together with George Oken, who was ex-US Navy SEAL and also linked to the Gambino Mafia. Shipments of containers of heroin coming from Kuwait to New York with the Gambino Mafia. Arms shipments, machine guns with hush puppies and night goggles being sold to Argentina, Ireland, Poland, East Germany, linked to Abu Nidal, all paid for through transactions with BCCI and the involvement of Peter Wiednieks in the US Customs transfer of those particular items, and including gold bullion, and also the drugs and arms with CIA. And also, the most important thing is today's podcast, CIA's PROMIS software. He was investigating that it had been installed into Swift banking with the octopus. Summary: he's found in a bathtub both wrist slash. One has 11 massive slashes on the left, as you can see, and if you can believe it, reaches across and starts slashing the other one. They ruled it a suicide. Yet, his briefcase with all his documentary evidence that I've covered in previous podcasts, the checks signed by Khashoggi and Gorbanafar with the transactions, is missing. Plus his bag, 2 envelopes of documents that had been given to him with documents from Standoff, who was found murdered in the boot of his car, who worked with NSA, provided documents to Danny, and 2 large document folders, as large as 2 children sitting on the back seat, as testified by Danny's son, were always in his car. In fact, neighbours thought that Danny had 2 little children that's always sitting in the back seat. That's how high the pile of documents were. They were missing from his car as well. So, 21 years. I won't dwell on this, you know, but I'm a physicist, but my heroes are Niels Bohr, Max Planck and Richard Feynman. When the classical model couldn't explain how nature works, when you get down to observing photons and electrons, they had to move to quantum physics, where we're mapping the probabilities in 3D space and also 4D, including time, where you will observe a photon or you'd observe an electron. And it's only once you map out the probability distribution and collapse it down that it shows you where and when you would be able to see nature. And that's the same principles that you have to apply to the octopus. Master of disguise, cloaked in national security, protected by justice worldwide. How I overlap with this story, I've mentioned to you, worked for Rupert Murdoch's company that sold the PROMIS software to Australian government. I had a federal inquiry, parliamentary inquiry going into threats made against me given my knowledge of what they do. And then I was doing a partnership with United Nations SEAL program for encryption with my company, endorsed by the Australian federal government, partnerships with Johns Hopkins institutions and also KPMG, and we were destroyed by a bogus prince who appeared in Australia, who's part of a CIA Operation Steel Point. And this relates to the money laundering of PROMIS software and Project Hammer. Most important thing is that I do have credibility. I worked as a science advisor. I have letters of support from cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister who supported me to get a federal investigation of fraud against Johns Hopkins going, which was completely shut down. So, we have a federal inquiry, federal police. I contact Michael in 2004. I'll do a podcast on this, which is in 2004, June. President Ford and his company appear mysteriously wanting to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me with the directors of Johns Hopkins. Turns out that President Ford is on the board of Citibank with C. Michael Armstrong, who is the chairman of the Johns Hopkins trustees, together with John Deutsch, former director of CIA. It wasn't a coincidence. It was damage control. So, Robert Booth Nichols makes threats. Paul Wolfowitz, let's concentrate now on this part. In June 2004, I'm communicating directly with Michael Riconosciuto by letters. He confirms in writing to me that the first application, the original client was NATO and US Navy for the modified PROMIS software for tracking the Soviet nuclear submarines. And it was integrated into the missile file control systems and command systems of the US Trident submarines using the VAX 11 780 computers. Previous podcasts confirm that. Independently of Michael, based on my partners, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Department, who were working with Hadron, with Earl Bryan, to develop that system together with the architect of NSA's Echelon program. The next thing he said is the modified PROMIS software was renamed the Lean software and it was sold to the Australian government. Previous podcasts confirmed that, independent of Michael. It turns out that Rupert Murdoch's company developed the Lean software for the Federal Attorney General. It was integrated with all intelligence, defence, banking systems, government databases in breach of the privacy and confidentiality legislation of Australia, which triggered a full parliamentary inquiry. It was tabled a year later after Michael's imprisoned. It turns out it's true, independently validated by me. It's Rupert Murdoch's company, who's funding CIA's program with William Casey and Walter Remand and Charles Wick. The doors were opened by Roy Cohen. I invite you to watch the new Netflix movie on Where's My Roy Cohen to see who he represents and the standards and ethics that he represents in the world to open that door. His links with them representing the mafia and also known to be involved in Operation Compromise with CIA agent Edwin Wilson in terms of compromising politicians, business leaders and government officials in White House in order to make deals. The second application that Michael told me was the modified PROMIS software was designed for the SWIFT banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan and Hadron Inc. and the CIA to move their covert funds through international automatic clearinghouses. Let's touch on that today and why I'm upsetting the neocons, particularly Paul Wolfowitz. Danny CASOLARO, the telephone records confirmed that he was talking directly to Chuck Hayes. I've verified all the telephone numbers. We've interviewed Chuck Hayes, and I've also got a whole podcast I'll do on the evidence that Chuck Hayes has when links with CIA and Project Hammer. He was telling Danny that Project Hammer is a joint CIA and NSA SWIFT banking software network worldwide with supercomputers that moves currencies around and produces high yield returns. Unknown to Danny is that in 2000, only weeks before General Earl Cockey dies, he gives testimony in court that he was running Project Hammer for World Bank, Nukenham Bank, Citibank, and it used the PROMIS software. So this podcast is going to bring evidence in over 21 years that Danny was on the right track. Danny CASOLARO was on the right track. He was going to come back with the head of the octopus. And I believe that this is the reason why he was murdered, to take all his evidence and briefcase from the scene of the crime. So let's now focus on upsetting the neocons. 4 weeks earlier, before Bill tells me I'm upsetting the neocons and Paul Wolfowitz is leading the charge to shut down my research, the mystery stake man who came to see me in December 2004, I discover is Robert Booth Nichols. This is what he said to me. This is a picture of him in the movie Under Siege with Steven Seagal. He appears in the movie with his wife. I'll do a podcast on Robert Booth Nichols and his wife and what they were doing in Australia. Very detailed. Your research is upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, he says, and you do not know who you're dealing with until you get a crowbar to the back of the head. That's his first line. Second, if you continue with your investigations, you will have the military coming down on you. So then he says, all your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. That caught me off guard. But at that point I knew that this was PROMIS that he's talking about, not the SBS program with John Hopkins. However, 21 years later, I find it's one and the same. On the very day that Robert Booth Nichols threatens me, Marshall Wilson, who's a journalist with the Courier Mail, with News Limited, owned by Rupert Murdoch, he's been endeavouring to get his stories up, cleared by lawyers, revealing PROMIS, the links of PROMIS in Australia with Earl Bryan, donations to Alan Bond, and involving Wackenhut. He's interviewed Ari Ben-Menashe previously in 1991 when he was in Australia seeking an asylum, whilst giving testimony to a US Congress about Robert Gates being involved with the sale of arms to Iraq. Richard Babian and Ari Ben-Menashe, their testimonies are sealed, but we do know what they were saying, and we do know what they were doing in Australia. But anyway, Marshall calls me. He says, Peter, guess who's in Australia today? I say, who? He says, Michael Ledeen. He's in Melbourne today, and he's speaking at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I said back, that's amazing. I've just met with a mysterious man that previously owned the Baron of Beith restaurant and guest house in the Dandenongs that was used as a safe house for the CIA and Mafia during the Nukenham Bank days, and he made threats against my life and advised that my research was upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and all my troubles in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. I told him my research into the PROMIS software and P2 Lodge with banker Ambrosio Anna and BCCI confirms that Michael Ledeen works as an advisor to both Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley. So what would be the chance that Robert Booth Nichols appears in Australia to threaten me about my research into PROMIS, and it's on the same day that Michael Ledeen's in town in Melbourne when Robert Booth Nichols is in Melbourne threatening me? See, Marshall Wilson had worked with me, with Carlos Moreira, when we launched the UN SEAL program for trade. That's a previous podcast. Please watch it. It's very detailed. It shows you why we were destroyed to launch encryption programs for trade worldwide with all countries. And he was writing and running the magazine Overseas Trading and publishing all the articles. And he witnessed our program that I had launched with the federal government together with Carlos in 1997. And then this bogus prince appears, promising $1.4 billion gift live on TV in Australia and CNN broadcast worldwide. And then media within 24 hours declare he's a fraud. He's a failed business builder and businessman from Queensland, dumped his family, now claiming to be the, Prince Haji, Mohammed Al Gos van Aldik. Please watch previous podcasts. I prove that he's part of a CIA operation representing the Philippines banks, Bank of South Pacific, for laundering billions of dollars of gold bullion with the Marcos government, Ferdinand Marcos, plus Russian rubles, gold bullion, China, Russia, with CIA. It's called Operation Steel Point. But here's the evidence. Michael Ledeen's in town. Guest speaker. US foreign policy in the age of terrorism. What's the chance that he's in town the same day that Robert Booth Nichols is threatening me over my evidence of the PROMIS software? Well, let's have a look at the biography of Dwayne Claridge, his life in the CIA, and what he had to say about Michael Ledeen, who's his best friend. His links direct with manager Gorbanafar, who he introduced to Ted Shackley. So Michael Ledeen is the key person that introduced manager Gorbanafar to Ted Shackley. And Michael Ledeen works as a personal advisor to Ted Shackley and Alexander Haig. So what's the chances that my problems lead to Alexander Haig? Robert Booth Nichols is the person delivering the threats and the message, and Michael Ledeen's in town, who works for Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley, the key figure involved with the Iran-Contra tow missile deal, paid for by BCCI, financed by the Kuwait royal family, and they're the checks that Danny Casolaro had as evidence when he dies. Dwayne Claridge confirms categorically the role of Michael Ledeen in the Iran-Contra affair. He was working directly with Theodore Shackley. Theodore Shackley and Ledeen were providing war games type training for European intelligence services, particularly Italy's intelligence service. He also says that Ledeen's damage to Jimmy Carter that undermined his presidential election campaign to get Reagan elected was greatly appreciated by Alexander Haig. And then we can see that Haig links with the generals in the Italian military intelligence services in SISMI, goes all the way back to P2 Lodge and also to banker Ambrosiana, because I had uncovered evidence independently that Alexander Haig owned Commodore International in Canada and Bahamas with the attorney who represented banker Ambrosiana overseas with Robert Calvi, Michelle Sindona, and Archbishop Paul Masinkas. You can't get any tighter than that. That was not known, and that was evidence that I uncovered before Robert Nichols appeared, and so when he said the name Alexander Haig, I already knew that he had intercepted my communications, confidential communications with Bill Hamilton, that I'd uncovered that evidence and the link. But he categorically says, Dwayne Claridge says, that Michael Ledeen is a personal close friend of his. So Michael Ledeen turns up mysteriously on this very same day that Robert Burt Nichols is making these threats that all my problems lead to Alexander Haig, and I'm upsetting some powerful Israeli businessmen. And we know Michael Ledeen is one of the key suspects who was considered to be the Israeli mole within the Pentagon and NSC, including Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and also Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby. So I'm upsetting the neocons. I had been investigating and interviewing at length James Rothstein. He arrested CIA assassin Frank Sturgis during the Watergate scandal. He was also an undercover informer investigating with the US Customs evidence involving Peter Wiedniks and Michael Riconosciuto. He also investigated CIA Operation Human Compromise involving Roy Cohen and Ed Wilson. He also received a telephone call from Pope Paul I 2 weeks before his mysterious death, requesting Rothstein to investigate evidence of pedophiles in the Catholic Church and also fraud involving banker Ambrosiana. But this is what he told me in his detailed interviews. I've recorded all my interviews with him over nearly 21 years. I was hired as an undercover investigator by Alexander Magnus. He was a US presidential candidate to investigate evidence that his foundation was being used by Oliver North and Tom Posse. Tom Posse links with the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party. I was hired as an undercover investigator also by US Customs to investigate evidence that Peter Wiedniks had purged himself during Michael Riconosciuto's court trial. He met with Michael Riconosciuto, interviewed him, and verified Michael's testimony. During our investigations of Peter Wiedniks, we were all shocked, I should say, when Alexander Haig suddenly and mysteriously intervened and shut down the US Customs investigation. That's the key point. All my problems in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. I'm investigating the PROMIS software and I'm interviewing Jimmy Rothstein. And Alexander Haig is a personal friend of Peter Wiedniks. My understanding is they play tennis together. But why would he intervene to shut down the customs investigation that he clearly lied during Michael Riconosciuto's trial, denying that he knew Michael? Michael's allegations are that Peter Wiedniks delivered the Inslaw PROMIS tapes to Wackenhut for him to modify. The secretary to Earl Bryan has given a testimony that both Peter Wiedniks and Michael Riconosciuto were calling Dr. Earl Bryan routinely and regularly. So clearly Peter Wiedniks had purged himself during the investigation and Alexander Haig intervened, and this is happening in 2000. So 2000, after Daniel Casolaro's death, this is where Alexander Haig appears. Now in 2000 he's not the US Secretary of State. He's no longer the Supreme Commander of NATO. So on whose authority does he intervene to shut down a US customs investigation into Peter Wiedniks? One can only assume that he's shutting it down because the evidence implicating PROMIS, arms and shipments, linking the banks Banca Ambrosiana, BCCI, Nugan Bank, connections with the Gambino Mafia in the US, New York and Italy, is quite dangerous for Alexander Haig. So here we go. I've got Robert Booth Nichols turning up. Same day Michael Ledine's in town, who works as an advisor personally for Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig, and Alexander Haig intervenes to shut down Peter Wiednieks. So, why is the research that I'm doing in Australia on the PROMIS software upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and all my problems lead to Alexander Haig? I believe that this picture tells the story. But let's go further. I then investigate Alexander Magnus, who was financing Jimmy Rothstein, and he had financed a book that was exposing the Oklahoma City bombing. In the book, it was alleging that Oliver Buck Revel, a retired FBI deputy director, complained that the book and Oklahoma City bombings and the politics of terror, he was accused of allowing mass murder. He lost the court case. At issue was an accusation in the book that Oliver Buck Revel had advanced knowledge of the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland, and personally pulled his son and daughter-in-law off the plane on the tarmac of London Airport. This is very important because I have a complete interview with Michael Riconosciuto where he and his wife has also given independent interviews, which I have recorded, while Michael was in prison, verifying what Michael has said to me directly, is that on the night that it was on the news that the Pan Am Flight 103 had come down with the McKee team, that were coming back with all the evidence of CIA involvement in drugs in Lebanon, the telephone call that he received panicked him. He made telephone calls immediately, had flown across to Oklahoma to visit a key person and found that he was murdered, including his family. He was a member of the McKee team who'd come back earlier. Michael confirms categorically that Robert Booth Nichols was the leak, and that the daughter of George Pender had changed the flights of all of the members of the McKee team so they were all on the same plane. That testimony has been given to me by Michael and independently by his wife, who witnessed the telephone calls and Michael being really upset and flying out on that night. It was the FIDCO board, George Pender, Robert Mayhew, Robert Booth Nichols, that were involved. Now, the evidence of that is critical because Michael gave me that testimony independently, and also Jimmy Rothstein, who investigated this matter, also confirms the evidence of the briefcase with the bombs and the devices that were tracked down with the items of clothing in the briefcase were traced to an office adjacent to a building, an office owned by Isram Barghouti in Malta. And the evidence shows that Richard Secord introduced Isram Barghouti to Wackenhut. And so evidence was leading to Isram Barghouti. And Michael's testimony shows that it was the FIDCO board, Robert Booth Nichols, George Pender, involved in the leak and the changing of the flights for the McKee team to be on the same plane. So this is quite an impressive process that Jimmy is actually involved with this. And then I did further searches about Tom Posse because Alexander Magnus was concerned that the evidence was that Oliver North and Tom Posse were using his foundation as a front for the whole Iran-Contra program, and he's running, Alexander Magnus is running as a presidential candidate, and he doesn't want a scandal coming out. And I found this report for FBI is that they were investigating evidence of a notorious terrorist criminal gang known as the Order. There's their symbol. And it was involved in leading up to Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. And Tom Posse was leader of an Alabama group called the Civilian Material Assistance, CMA. And it had its origins in anti-communist group, and it was helping the Contras in Nicaragua. It had murky connections to government through Iran-Contra program, and Posse had been called to testify during congressional hearings on the scandal. So this is an investigation by FBI. When we go through it even further, it talks about further involvement, and it's involving guns, silencers, and infrared goggles. Hence the sales of arms, very similar to all of the investigations that Danny had been doing. But also the purchase of Stinger missiles. So Tom Posse, together with his links with Oliver North, this is how Jimmy Rothstein got involved, and then got led to the US Customs investigation involving Peter Wiednieks. They got shut down by Alexander Haig. So it brings us back to the question, why would Robert Booth Nichols turn up threatening me? Why would Michael Ledeen be in town on the very day that he makes the threats? And given that it's upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and it leads to Alexander Haig. Let's go a bit further. Michael Ledeen, his relationship with Ted Shackley in the Iran-Contra affair. All the evidence shows that he was the key person who introduced manager Gorbanifar to Ted Shackley for the deal, for the Iran-Contra sales with the Israeli government, directly with Prime Minister Shimon Peres. It is categorical, and this part's very important. Why would Robert Booth Nichols be worried about my research into the PROMIS software? And why would Michael Ledeen be personally in town on the same day? And that is that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North first used the money from Iran to fund the Nicaraguan resistance in November 1985. He later testified, however, that the diversion of funds was proposed to him by Gorbanifar during a meeting in January 1986. And listen to this. Saudi billionaire arms trader Adnan Khashoggi said in an interview on ABC TV December 11th, 1986, that he advanced $1 million to help finance the first arms shipment in the Iran-Contra arms scandal, and put up $4 million for the second shipment. Now notice those numbers, $1 million, $4 million. It's dedicated now to Danny. He had the checks. He was on his way to Martinsburg to trade these checks that they were paid by BCCI, involving William Casey, Robert Gray, Clint Murchison on the board of Fitco, and also the Kuwait royal family financed them. His wrists are multiple slashes on both sides rule it. His briefcase with the checks are missing. Bags and envelopes of other transactions for the sale of PROMIS software. In previous podcasts, I showed the evidence that never appeared at the BCCI inquiry. I have a recorded interview with Jack Blum. Danny had called him on his home number twice. Jack Blum confirms that this evidence was never presented. Danny had the receipts of the transaction, 1 million and 4 million. This is all going through BCCI accounts. There's the signed cheque for 1 million with Adnan Khashoggi. And there's a cheque for 4 million, Adnan Khashoggi with Gorbanafar. So let's go back. 1 million with Adnan Khashoggi, Gorbanafar. 4 million, Adnan Khashoggi, Gorbanafar. Letters clearing the transactions, BCCI Monte Carlo. In my interview with Jack Blum and the evidence of the BCCI inquiry, Senator Carey's and the attorneys demanded that Robert Altman presents all transactions with Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanafar through the Monte Carlo accounts. They were never submitted by Robert Altman, Clark Clifford, and Robert Altman provided all except these, and Danny had them. These are a copy of what Danny had, and he took down with him to Martinsburg. It is quite clear, dated September 1985, it's 4 million and 1 million, involving the very first transactions with Oliver North, Gorbanafar, Ted Shackley and Michael Ledeen. The court cases I've already covered. Evidence, Robert Sensi gave testimony that he was working for William Casey, Robert Gray, Clint Murchison Jr., Kuwait royal family when he did those checks. And he's testified of his involvement with Gorbanafar. So that's why Michael Ledeen's in town. That's why Robert Burt Nichols is threatening me. So let's now go to the next bit. I've been threatened by Robert Burt Nichols, December 2005. February 2004, I receive a telephone call. Bill Hamilton, I've been advised by a trusted source that the neocons are very upset about your research into the PROMIS software. His contact advised him that he's just learnt that Paul Wolfowitz is leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby to shut down your research. What a strange call to get. Now, it's only a couple of weeks after Robert Burt Nichols has appeared. My TV programs, 2 of them have been running about the fraud committed by John Hopkins. And Michael Ledeen was in town on the very day that I'm being threatened by Robert Burt Nichols. And then I get this message, the neocons. And I think to myself, well, how does Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby fit into this? And then it happens. My research that I'm going to show you, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby, that PROMIS software was put in at Pentagon. It's part of CIA Operation Steel Point to bankrupt the Soviet Union, but also finance all the arms being sold to Saddam Hussein. I will follow this up with a detailed transaction records of Operation Steel Point involving the Bank of Iraq, where they seized all of the gold bullion, trillions of dollars of assets after invading Iraq. It involves Project Hammer, World Bank, Guggenheim Bank, Citibank, PROMIS software. I then email to Bill Hamilton. Can you remember who personally advised you that Wolfowitz was leading the efforts of Richard Pearl? My research confirms clearly in 1982 that Rafi Aiton met with top CIA agent, I know his name and I'll do that in a podcast, responsible for the $2 billion broker of death arms deal, which involves Iran and Iraq. It involves the former director of DIA, It was sponsored by GINSA, founded by Michael Ledeen, to fly to Israel. Rafi Eitan was reviewing with them the success of CIA, DIA, IDF collaborative aerostat drone AWAC radar tracking technology during the war in Lebanon. This part's important. Peter Wiedniks was responsible for the US Customs War on Drug program with Hadron Inc. and also with a company called Airships Industries International, owned by Alan Bond, a media baron from Australia, for the US Customs War on Drug program for detection of all aircraft and ships bringing drugs into the USA. That's what Peter Wiedniks was managing. It involves drones, AWACS, radar tracking technology, and that was one of the first applications that were involved with this project. I then send another email back to Bill. Michael Ledeen worked for Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley and appeared in Melbourne, Australia as the guest speaker for the Australian-Israel Business Committee on the same day Robert Booth Nichols met with me, confirming that he works with CIA and Mafia and threatened my life. He then advised me that all my problems in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. Paul Wolfowitz was leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scoot when they were founders of GINSA and PANAC. So now we've got the link. I'm going to do a complete podcast on this part because this is the genesis of Rafi Eitan being personally involved in the PROMIS deal with William Casey and Richard Secord, arranged by Michael Ledeen. I then send back the email. Rafi Eitan then met in Israel with Richard Secord and William Casey, known as CIA's Operation Tip Kettle. I'll do a whole podcast on this because it's very important. It links to the evidence that Danny was investigating with Dr. Earl Bryan, Peter Wiedniks, George Oken, and a Mossad agent called Solomon Schwartz. It'll just blow your mind apart when you see how clever Danny was. He'd worked out all this. He probably didn't know about Operation Tip Kettle, but that's the genesis of Iran-Contra. And it was negotiations directly with Rafi Eitan for Israel to sell CIA their large cache of PLO AK-47s captured from PLO and other weapons so they could sell it to the Nicaraguan resistance and deny all plausible deniability that the US is involved. That was the deal. Rafi Eitan requested William Casey to prove Israel to acquire the high security clearance company Numax Electronics that manufactures night vision technologies as payment. When I do the podcast on that, you'll now understand how the deals were done. And Danny had the memos of the $2.5 billion, not million, billion dollar brokers of death arms deal involving the same CIA agent that was sponsored by Paul Wolfowitz and Michael Ledeen to fly to Israel and meet directly with Rafi Eitan. I have the legal proof. That agent set up the whole brokers of death deal for $2.5 billion arms to Iran and Iraq with Oliver North, and Danny held the memo. It states, what does Oliver North want to do with Noriega's drug contacts? So let's come back to this. The neocons are really upset. It's February 2005. I've worked out why, but this is very important. If you go to his biography on Wikipedia, you'll see that he was appointed as the president of the World Bank. I was very interested. He was also the former dean of Johns Hopkins. I've been prosecuting the directors of Johns Hopkins. I've got a federal police investigation. I've got Robert Booth Nichols turning up, threatening me, and then I've got Paul Wolfowitz intervening as well. So the link of Johns Hopkins stands out in my mind. But when I go on to next podcast after this one, he was the biggest advocate for the Iraq War. He left Pentagon and then gets appointed as the president of the World Bank, and then had to resign over his own personal scandals. What a disaster. But this link of Pentagon, World Bank, together with PROMIS, I'm a threat to him 4 weeks before the announcement's made. I was trying to work out why I'm a threat. Why would Robert Nichols turn up? And why would I be told that Paul With is leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby? And I'm told that in February, 4 weeks before he's appointed. It's got something to do with the World Bank. There's something that he's involved in PROMIS, intimately involved with Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby. The neocons are involved. We know Rafi Aiton's involved, but how do we prove that they're involved? Well, have a look at this. When I do all my research for Danny CASOLARO, he was investigating the evidence that PROMIS software was installed at the World Bank. So let's go back. This guy, Paul Wolfers, is about to be appointed as the president of the World Bank. Does he know that the PROMIS software was used at Pentagon and the World Bank for the biggest money laundering operation for financing secret wars? The answer is yes. This is the handwriting of Danny. He's following through that the World Bank was using a DEC 1170. That's very important because that's a very powerful computer my background is in computing like Michael's, so I worked on DEC equipment, PDP-11s and VAX and other supercomputers. So I know what this was designed for, and apparently that's where the Inslaw software was put in for the bank software. And Danny's following through the history of Inslaw's installation at the World Bank at a data center in Maryland. If I go further, Danny's homing in now that yes, it's the DEC 1170. He's aware that there were multiple data centers set up for the World Bank. There was an IBM, a Burroughs version and a DEC version. The Burroughs version is what CIA was using before they moved across to IBM and DEC mainframes, particularly the DEC 11780s, the Intergraph. So Danny is definitely on the trail of the World Bank. He also goes through that he's now found out that there are huge disk drives that have to be backed up. The World Bank paid Control Data to do all their backup of their records for archiving. He even found Systems Industry did the disk storage for the 1170s, and Control Data did all of the hardware maintenance. Now, Control Data is very important. Computer Power Group by Rupert Murdoch bought out Control Data Institute. So their link with Control Data is very intimate when working on PROMIS software, particularly for banking. So he's following through. He's found the vendors that do it in Virginia and back it up. He found that they were in Alexandria, Systems Industry. He's now making telephone calls. He's found the World Bank, Control Data, Systems Industry, $25,000 per month for maintenance for the Inslaw PROMIS software. Because remember, Inslaw's gone bankrupt. It's been forced into bankruptcy, and now there's a temptation that they can take all of the software at World Bank and just use it themselves, particularly intelligence agencies. So he's following that through. Data center originally set up for justice. Now that's interesting. The data center was originally set up for justice. So the World Bank, collaboration with the Department of Justice. This is the part that caught my attention. He now says that the World Bank employs a person responsible for it. It's the manager for the information system is Rayleigh Neal. says that it's an Indian worked on the install software. So Danny's hot on the trails of the World Bank. Is this what Paul Wolfowitz is worried about? He then makes further calls and gets told that Rayleigh is dark-skinned of Indian tone. So he's an Indian. That's as much as I could find, but Danny was definitely on the trail of Inslaw's PROMIS software was sold to the World Bank, installed at the World Bank. So I did a research. I said, well, where can I find this guy, Rayleigh? And I went through all the newspapers, and here it is. There's an article on some sort of hairdressers that were operating and such forth, and the service. But it says, Black Barbershop Shop says Rayleigh Neal, a retired World Bank official, is one of the few things that survived integration. And he was talking about the barber shop. So that verifies independently an article that I found at the time, and eventually I was able to find his obituary. And there he is. There's a picture of him, definitely Indian complexion, and Rayleigh O'Neal, and he was based in Tacoma, Washington. So Danny was hot on the trails of evidence that he was exposing with the World Bank. So I have Paul Wolfowitz leading the charge to shut down my research. I've uncovered the link with Computer Power Group, has developed all the Swift banking software with WANG Labs and Hadron and SimCom for CIA. It's installed with Echelon, NSA, State Department and US Treasury for James Baker. So is it possible that he's worried about taking the position as the president, and he's intimately involved with the neocons in using the PROMIS software with Raffiatin infiltrating banks, and particularly in his role with Pentagon? And the answer is yes. The two applications were for tracking nuclear submarines, the PROMIS software, and the second application was for Swift banking. So my research then uncovered the real application integration of PROMIS software, CIA, DIA, safe Swift banking software, developed and integrated by Hadron Inc., SimCom Inc. with Earl Bryan, and Computer Power Group by Rupert Murdoch, and WANG Labs. And here it is. Iris Corp, incorporated in the Netherlands, 1981 and 82 and 83, and then it went bankrupt. A scandal broke out and everyone had to run for cover. But who's it headed by? Robert McNamara, World Bank. Isn't that interesting? Danny's investigating the evidence of the PROMIS software being sold and installed in the World Bank and being exploited by the intelligence agencies. And in 1981 and 82 and 83, a company called Iris Corp, incorporated in the Netherlands, is now using all of the CIA, DIA safe Swift banking software with NRO, NSA Echelon eavesdropping network. This is economic espionage on a large scale using Inslaw's PROMIS software to integrate all databases of intelligence, banking vendors worldwide who have different software databases, but that's the power of what Inslaw had. It could integrate all the disparate databases, multi-vendor, seamlessly. And guess what? Who's it launched by? Barry Kelly, CIA, the architect involved and responsible for CIA safe software for William Casey. Lee Feldman, Pentagon, DIA, architect. And Paul Boker, US State Department, who worked for Henry Kissinger and Robert Gray. They appointed Edward Heath, former Prime Minister of UK, were the ambassadors for Iris Corp. I've now found the proof, and it was put into all the banks worldwide, with the Club of Rome, and that all the investors were Kissinger associate clients with Kissinger. And Robert Gray are fronting. These two guys are the ones that are running the whole integration process with all the clients and bankers. They're all clients of them. His clients, BCCI, Kuwait Royal Family, Nicaraguan Resistance. This guy has all of the major banks, finance ministers worldwide from all countries. This is the octopus for banking. Previous podcast I proved the architects for the technology, the SWIFT banking network, the SWIFT banking software, the SWIFT intelligence database integration across all agencies was Earl Bryan's companies and Rupert Murdoch's companies. Common investor, Allen & Co. They own Resorts International casinos with Mayor Lansky. The biggest money laundering operations is Resort International in Bahamas, Las Vegas casinos. But the most important thing is these guys are in financing the intelligence. So WANG Labs, Hadron Inc., Simcom, Computer Power Group. This guy comes to Australia and does the biggest integration project for Australian government for integrating all databases across all agencies for tracking banks. It's hooked into Echelon. NROL, together with NSA, CIA and DIA, but the vendors were Computer Power Group, WANG Labs and Hadron Inc. So the architecture of the software for the whole SWIFT banking network worldwide is these guys for the technologies and software. But these guys are running the whole show for commercializing it. And here they are. It was originally running on a Burroughs computer. That's what World Bank had. I have all of the memos of William Casey upset that it's turns out the Burroughs is not powerful enough and they have to move across to the VAX digital computer with Intergraph and also the IBM mainframes. And previous podcasts I cover Operation Steel Point with Leo Wanta, with the bogus prince, his letters to Bush Jr. and also President Clinton confirm that they were using the NSA's PROMIS software from Inslaw on a DEC VAX 117080s and also IBM 3090s. So I have all the memos where Casey's upset is the architecture for the Burroughs turns out it's not sufficient, so they had to upgrade it in 1982. So these guys are starting to launch it on the Burroughs, and that's when they are faced with the scalability of it, having problems. Here's the key points. Lee Feldman worked with Pentagon, DIA. Expertise in these areas was for CIA Pentagon integration. Barry Kelly, CIA and former Moscow station chief. I mean, you can't get any higher than that. And he's going to be running the show. So these two guys are the founders together with Paul Boca, State Department, and worked for Henry Kissinger. And then, don't you love this? The other person they got on, the fourth one, was John Culp, who was worked with Citibank in Hong Kong and Netherlands. And so here we have it. We've got the World Bank, we've got Citibank, and we've got the PROMIS CIA software that was developed by Hadron Inc. together with Computer Power Group, Rupert Murdoch, Dr. Earl Bryan, and also TRW for the Echelon program with NSA and NROL. So, a couple of things here. talks about that it's going to be better than CIA. It's going to provide political intelligence. It's going to be looking at reducing insurance risks and banking risks based on feeding all media news articles and historical records and polls and such forth integrated as a complete intelligence unit. So it's going to use the best of integrated CIA, NSA, DIA, plus the media barons to predict where the risks will be so that no one gets caught losing money when wars erupt and revolutions happen. Sounds good to begin with until the octopus gets their hand on it. So, business risks. Isn't that interesting that Joseph Queller was employed by Business Risks International? Isn't it interesting that I'm being destroyed with John Hopkins by the architects of Echelon who owned iJet, which is Travel Risks International for all the corporations, and they're the architects of Echelon. I think what's really good about it is that it ties together nicely all the evidence that this is when they tried to go global with the World Bank and IMF. So this is all happening in 81, 82 and 83, the same time period. The migration to the DEC VAX was done by Michael, the VAX 11780. And Michael told me that then they were using the Intergraph VAX, which was designed more for Echelon, more powerful, and also does integration of graphical information systems, which is critical for when you're trying to track information intelligence graphically. So, a couple of things here. You can see, look at the people they put on board. Former British Prime Minister, McNamara, head of the World Bank, former head, French Trade Minister, Colombia Finance Minister, Foreign Minister for Japan. You can't get any higher than this. And it's for decision makers. It's a decision support system for reducing risks in intelligence, and they take a photograph of the launch. It's standing in front of a computer that belonged to the World Bank. So further evidence that CIA Safe, CIA Swift was installed, that developed by Hadron, Wang Labs, Computer Power Group, Earl Bryan, Rupert Murdoch, is integrated throughout World Bank and IMF. All of the people here from the biggest banks in the UK, a mystery investor, Mr. X, that doesn't want to be identified. I believe I know who he is. And so basically you're talking about all the clients. When I looked up all of the key people who are the investors and bankrolling it, they were all clients and directors of Kissinger Associates. So as you go through here, you're looking at former secretaries of state, Treasury. And then here it is. It's got Reagan's campaign public relations. Gray and Company were hired. Robert Gray. The former Treasury Secretary, who happens to be the chairman of Burroughs Corp, which is the IRIS CIA safe software, has been developed from day one. So you've got US Treasury intimately involved. I thought this was good. Maurice Strong with CEDA is also interested in the IRIS CIA safe Swift banking software, and that fits in with how they got it into the PROMIS software into Canada through CEDA. Saudi Arabia Research and Marketing Corp. I found that these are the investors behind BCCI. And then it got into trouble. They got into a dispute, legal battle. Everyone's embarrassed. Everyone's threatening to sue each other. And so it turns out that Mr. Kelly goes back to CIA. So you can see that he's on loan. Let me go through some of these things with you. How did this all start? Apparently, the Iran Revolution the Iran hostage crisis caught all the bankers and industrial companies off guard, where they lost huge investments when a major revolution takes place, unexpected. And so this proposal for IRIS using the CIA software is going to be the best intelligence known to mankind that will help allow banks make more money and not take financial risks. Lloyd's of London Insurance was an investor. They wanted to be able to minimise their risks by having the inside intelligence on what's happening worldwide. So we have all of the taxpayers paying for NSA, CIA, DIA and Echelon, who pay the bills for the Cold War, preventing nuclear war, and then you've got all of these White House people getting onto private companies who are going to benefit from reducing their risks of investments and selling that risk information, minimisation and intelligence to countries worldwide. So you've got them on the gravy train. So basically, this is just corruption. White House cashing in on billions and trillions of dollars of nuclear weapons being built and arms sales, and then they're cashing in on the banks, on the board of banks and insurance companies, making money. This further shows the banks, Liechtenstein. These are all, by the way, directors, Seascope, all of these CEOs and chairmen are all on the boards of Kissinger and Associates. That's a conflict of interest if I ever saw one. So, I think I'm proving to you that Paul Wolfowitz, being appointed as the new president of the World Bank, leading the charge to shut me down 4 weeks before President Bush Jr. announces his appointment. I believe that PROMIS involves Pentagon, Robert McNamara, Paul Wolfowitz, in the World Bank, in IMF, just as Danny CASOLARO was investigating, and just as the evidence had shown in the testimonies and affidavits provided to Bill Hamilton during the Inslaw inquiry, an investigation that his software had been stolen, and he was holding the testimonies and affidavits of people saying that it was put into World Bank and IMF by Earl Bryan and his companies. So I thought this was very interesting. You know, you've got an assistant to the secretary of Henry Kissinger, but I was impressed that he was the ambassador of Bolivia, because I've got all the articles in my research showed the whole drug trade with the former Nazis was in Bolivia. That CIA was using former Nazis for illegal arms and drugs being financed for covert operations in Bolivia. And then we have this. I mean, it gets to a real head of a battle now. We've got a private CIA group. There's an investors meeting. They're not happy. They're being embroiled and becoming publicly known through some legal dispute. The owner have obviously got a legal dispute with the owner, Stout, who's obviously the founder of the company, and he's getting moved out and threatening litigation. And these people want him to remain faceless. You've got Prince Franz Joseph II, Liechtenstein. Red in the face, told his colleagues that his family's been in business for 400 years and never but never, he said, had it been involved in litigation. So this is how the real world works. These guys are making huge trillions of dollars in the banking industry with inside intelligence, inside dealing knowledge. And they don't want to be identified because these deals are done quietly with Kissinger and Associates, and it's becoming now public. This one was very interesting, is that the Soviet embassy in Washington showed interest in subscribing to the IRIS service. And then there was a dispute internally. Some of the former CIA men opposed the idea. But listen to this. While Boca the consummate diplomat, temporarily arguing that it would not be advisable to have the Soviet Union as our first client. They're happy to have him as their 10th, but they don't want it publicised that they're actually the first. So this just shows you the ethics of these senior White House officials. The Cold War, all the wars against communism, all the wars against the Soviet Union and China, missiles, threats of nuclear war, and when it comes to the bottom line, it's about making money with taxpayers' funds that paid for all of that. Now let's get to the serious stuff. I got into the CIA archives and recovered these records being released. It's dated 17th of December 1982. The Iris Systems Development Co., the company we're talking about, -SAFE. So there's your clarification. It's definitely the SAFE software developed by Earl Bryan and Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group, with WANG Labs. And a brief is written at the bottom. Iris System Development. Someone might ask, this is a memo to William Casey, internally from the deputy, just in case someone asks. Someone might ask us how these guys developed their pilot computer system in something like a year at a fraction that has been spent on SAFE. Well, of course it's SAFE. They've been building it since 1979. Billions of dollars of investments. So this is now William Casey directly involved. And then I found a note. Bill, having some knowledge of this outfit, the answer is, so he's prepping him for the answer, they didn't get their their computer is barely up, if at all, and the product is highly untested. So they're going commercial with the product that he says is only 2 or 3 clients so far, just to let him know that if anyone asks, they've only got 2 or 3 clients. I'm told, and there is through their contacts of the CIA on board. Now this is Barry Kelly. And it says the directors have Barry until April to show he has anything to tell. So he's on loan. The top CIA guy is on loan to help them get Iris launched. So this is involving William Casey. Let's go further. The Iris formation was first announced. They've attached to William Casey's briefing the news article that's just been released in case the media calls and asks questions. He wants to be prepared. When Iris formation was first announced, it was described as a private spy network or private CIA, a team of spooks. Boker and Atwood, Iris does have CIA-style technical resources. A former CIA man worked like newspaper, then a cloak and dagger team. The computer system was developed under direction of Barry Kelly, a retired CIA technology specialist who's now president of Iris. Then goes on to say that he designed the computer system to influence the analysis of the information the computer puts out. It has nothing to do with clandestine, dirty tricks. Also says the computer would enable Iris to assemble the results of public opinion polls in all 31 countries. This is really interesting, isn't it? Polling. Intelligence involved in public opinion polling to persuade public opinion before elections. So it really is integrated intelligence, political, economic and covert. Iris, as part of a database, the political analysis, it says the investors are, and it lists off all the investors again, Lloyds of London, the banks of England. Remember, they're all clients of, and directors are on the board of Kissinger Associates, so you can't get any higher than that. They confirm it's the most advanced computer technology, and it's at the sites of World Bank and the IMF. So let's now show you what I found. I dug deeper into the CIA archives and I found it. TRW/safe briefing with William Casey. See, William Casey made a boast before he died that he was proud of his greatest achievement, and that is that he had bankrupted the Soviet Union, won the Cold War. They were able to track, and he had his Star Wars program, which was to be able to knock out all Soviet missiles, nuclear submarines and missiles, by being able to track them. But you could only do that if you could integrate all the databases, and I think PROMIS was the key to that. And I think, without a doubt, PROMIS was used, as Michael said, for tracking nuclear submarines and put into the fire control systems so that they could integrate all databases across NATO to be able to coordinate and hit targets. So targets would be selected, best intelligence put in for tracking submarines on the bed floor with detectors and sonar, but also over the horizon, radar, critical to success, and also the AWACS. Okay, so you are looking at the most integrated software computer systems known to mankind, and the problem they had was, how do you integrate all the intelligence databases and systems together? And PROMIS, Inslaw's PROMIS, was the product at the right time. So TRW, and have a look at this. This is a copy of the memo for the briefing. Emphasise the importance of SAFE to DIA. This is TRW's briefing to William Casey. Mr. Casey visited the TRW facility in July 1981. 30-minute SAFE presentation went well. He expressed interest in how the CIA analysts would interact with the system. So now we know that it wasn't just Hadron, it wasn't just Simcom Inc., it wasn't just Computer Power Group, it wasn't just WANG Labs, it's TRW. This is Echelon. They run Pine Gap in Australia. You may recall that the Echelon eavesdropping network, TRW, its job is tracking Soviet nuclear submarines using over-the-horizon radar systems in Australia, and also listening. Intercepts all electronic emissions. It intercepts everything. But it also is the head for economic espionage, where it can infiltrate banks worldwide, governments worldwide, and it knows what trade's taking place, what bank transfers are taking place on credit cards, on transactions between countries for purchase and buying of materials and technologies, and that's how they bankrupt the Soviet Union. They infiltrated their banks, currencies, and were able to bankrupt them. And that's Leo Wanter's testimony, and I will do more in showing how Operation Still Point works. But you may remember Christopher Boyce, the Falcon and the Snowman movie. He worked for TRW, known as Black Vault, and it was the top secret security clearance he needed, and it was with the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, transmissions. It was while he was working there that he was disgusted. He was receiving CIA cables where they were expressing the agency's desire to depose the government of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in Australia. He also claimed CIA wanted Whitlam removed from office because he wanted to close US military bases, particularly Pine Gap, including the vital Pine Gap, and withdraw troops from Vietnam, because he wasn't happy, and neither was Dr. Jim Cairns, about the bombing of civilians, innocent people in Vietnam. And for these reasons, the US government pressure was a major factor in the dismissal of Whitlam. Now, if you watch my previous podcast, Robert Booth Nichols, Frank Colucci, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger and William Colby and Michael Hand from the Guggenheim Bank were directly involved with the dismissal of Gough Whitlam and the setup of a $4 billion Arab loans affair that brought down the Whitlam government. But he also says that the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, who according to Boyce was referred to as, in their memos from CIA, our man Kerr by the CIA officers. So TRW is responsible for the integration systems, computer systems, radar systems, the complete running of Pine Gap Echelon. Here are examples of the SAFE project where it has started with TRW, then implemented by Computer Power Group, Hadron Inc., Simcon and WANG Labs. The SAFE project is part of TRW's Echelon program. Their role was to also monitor. See, SAFE was the integration of all intelligence bases on one computer system across all agencies, and it was the greatest achievement that William Casey perceived that he achieved with the PROMIS software, because its integration of the Minuteman and the ballistic missile systems, defence systems, particularly the Trident fire control systems, as Michael said, and the over-horizon backscatter radar systems, which can detect the signatures of planes, ships, and also submarines, particularly the wake when their masts break the water. And they also intercept all electronic communications systems, any electromagnetic radiation emissions from phones, radar systems, planes, you name it. They can get a signature for all of those things and track them. And so as you can see, it's the complete integration of sensors and lining it up with targets for the fire control, combat systems and decision support. So you can see PROMIS had a big role to play, particularly for NATO, US Navy and NATO, but also for Echelon. It started in 78 and 79 through to 1980, the SAFE project in all its modules. And it shows that the components were going through from 84 and 83 and 82 with CIA and DIA components that they're building for an integrated system, right up to 1985. So these are the time periods of the architecture, and the integration took place through Burroughs. It started on Burroughs computers. It turned out that it couldn't handle the virtual memory and database mapping requirements, needed 32-bit architecture, which the VAX 11780 provided, and also the IBM 3090. And so there's an integration and transition process going inside CIA and DIA from Burroughs computers to the VAX and IBM systems and the VAX Intergraph systems right across from 1981 right through to 1985, even continuing to 1990. The biggest task was the database management for large structured and interrelated files, and that's really the key part that Inslaw's PROMIS software was going to provide. It had the unique power and flexibility to integrate all databases distributed across all architectures with online programming. And so that's why they stole it. It was purely Hadron wanted to acquire it with Allen and Company Finance, and then Computer Power Group got their hands on the tapes in 1982 when they asked to become the Australian and Asia distributor, and then claimed they didn't sell one copy of it, and then developed the Lean software. But remember, Pine Gap's in Australia and Northern Territory, and that's where the emphasis for all development of PROMIS software was emphasised, in a tiny little community in Northern Territory, predominantly Aboriginal community. That's where they decided that they would develop the PROMIS software. And of course, that reconfirms that it was being linked across on Burroughs architecture to begin with until they discovered, and as I said, I've got all the memos from William Casey himself expressing concern about the need to do the migration from the Burroughs across to the VAX and IBM mainframes. So it's joint CIA, DIA and TRW. That's Echelon. I won't spend much time, but it's integrated databases and graphical information systems, and that's when the graphical information systems of VAX computers designed with this architecture for Echelon is integrated. And here's an outlay of the rooms reserved for all of their Burroughs computers originally, and then they had to redesign it and dump Burroughs and move across. So that's why Iris Corp failed. It ran early on the Burroughs computer, and it turned out it couldn't handle the architecture and demands from the systems and memory, and they backed the wrong horse with the Burroughs computer. They needed the more advanced VAX 11780s. So let's recap. Overwhelming evidence that Hadron, Simcom, owned by Earl Bryan, partnership with WANG Labs, in partnership with Computer Powers Group, with Rupert Murdoch, the two media barons, financially backed by the same investor, Stanley Schuman, who was appointed onto the President's Foreign Intelligence Board. You only get there because you're working with intelligence. So clearly, they're the drivers of the software development, systems integration, and architecture that was needed for delivery together with TRW. But the breakout of the octopus were the bankers. As you can see, Barry Kelly, CIA, Lee Freeman, DIA, Paul Broker, State Department. And the real people wanting to exploit it was Robert Gray, who represented the Kuwait royal family, BCCI, Kuwait, the Nicaraguan resistance. He also represented Khashoggi, Robert Maxwell. Kissinger, finger in everything, worldwide. Robert McNamara, Pentagon, World Bank. The PROMIS CIA safe software was put into Pentagon. My next podcast will show you who did it. You're going to be astounded when I show you who it was that did that. But it went into Pentagon, and it was responsible for the greatest level of intelligence for bankrupting the Soviet Union. But it's all about banking. It's about controlling the economies. It's about moving precious metals, bonds. It's also about raising investment to fund wars. It's about theft of assets of countries worldwide that are exploited to make some people, the head of the octopus, very rich. It's corruption at the highest level. Just to finish it off, you may not know that in the BCCI investigation, just before Danny's killed, Kissinger Associates was going to acquire BCCI. The investigation shows that Kissinger Associates was doing a partnership for BCCI Kissinger Associates, and they were looking at a full acquisition before and after all the directors of BCCI were indicted. If you have a look at Kissinger Associates, you've got Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, Lawrence Eagleburger, Alan Stoger, and T. Jefferson Cunningham III. In late July 1991, only 2 weeks before Danny's found dead with both wrists slashed, briefcase of his signed BCCI checks, Khashoggi, Gorbachev, the 1 million, 4 million involving Michael Ledeen, Oliver North, Ted Shackley, Robert Gray, Robert Sensi, working for William Casey, Clint Murchison and the Kuwait royal family financed those checks. Found dead, both wrists slashed. Kissinger Associates is still talking about acquiring BCCI. Yet, before and after they're indicted, Kissinger Associates and BCCI Stationery discussed in general terms services that Kissinger Associates might perform for BCCI, and they were dated before and after BCCI's indictment on drug money laundering charges in Tampa with Noriega. If you notice down the bottom there that Kissinger Associates was being subpoenaed to provide all documents of their clients as part of the investigation. And it says here, BCCI documents the subcommittee investigation and to provide all documents pertaining to BCCI under an agreement that the subpoena not be served. Kissinger Associates refused, however, to provide the clients list, arguing that the lists were beyond the parameters of investigation into BCCI by the subcommittee, and advising the subcommittee that if it pursued the list, listen to this, Kissinger Associates would litigate the matter, if necessary, through an extensive appellate process to the Supreme Court. I mean, what arrogance. How can the people and citizens of Australia, of the United States, allow for anyone to refuse to cooperate with an investigation when they're acquiring the biggest money laundering bank known to mankind that's laundering drugs for Noriega and arms, and has resulted in the death of Danny Casolaro and other journalists and other key people who have been murdered when they investigated BCCI. And then we look at Robert Gray, the lobbyist for BCCI, the representative of the Kuwait royal family and directors of BCCI, particularly the royal family of Kuwait. And it says here that Von Raab was raising seriously concerns that there were 3 Democrats and 1 Republican that he said he believes were instrumental into helping squelch any investigation of BCCI. I mean, perverting justice. They were Clark Clifford, Robert Altman, and Robert Gray, and Frank Mackenwitz, who was also a director of Robert Gray's company. I know this one's a bit blurry, but John Kerry demanded that all those checks that Danny Casolaro had in his briefcase, that Danny Casolaro had picked up the telephone and called the private number of Jack Blum at his home number. I called the same numbers and interviewed him. Jack Blum admitted that if Danny had those checks in Virginia, in CIA territory, and he's waving them all around, what did he expect would happen to him? The fact is that Danny had them, and I've presented them to you from the files of Danny Casolaro, and those files and evidence was never submitted by the Martinsburg Police, the FBI, or the US Department of Justice Zipperstein investigators to the BCCI investigation that went for 2 years. It was never presented as evidence, the smoking gun, that the Kuwait royal family, William Casey, Robert Gray, had financed those BCCI checks for Khashoggi and Gulbenkian for the original Iran-Contra deal set up by Michael Ledeen with Ted Shackley and Gulbenkian and Khashoggi. The court cases, overwhelming. Danny was investigating the World Bank, BCCI. If you have a look at this evidence, it's a long podcast, but I'm showing you the head of the octopus, Robert Gray, Henry Kissinger, Ted Shackley, George Bush Sr. It goes to the top. The evidence was the PROMIS software was being used for BCCI, World Bank, IMF, by the intelligence agencies to bankrupt, yes, the Soviet Union. That was done by Leo Wanta. But these private individuals became billionaires by using the same software to evade detection by FinCEN, Austrac in Australia, and the equivalent FinCEN in Canada and the UK, because it's their software that was installed. It's the fox looking after the chicken coop. And so drugs and arms and fraud of security notes, gold bullion from countries worldwide has been passing through Operation Steel Point. So let's look at the summary. Danny CASOLARO had the evidence investigating PROMIS, BCCI, Iran-Contra. It was the same octopus. And Robert Booth Nichols turning up was no chance of throwing a dice. Joseph Queller turning up. Both of them flying back from Kuwait. They were protecting Ted Shackley, Robert Gray, George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, with the links with the Kuwait family who bankrolled those BCCI checks. The smoking gun for the BCCI investigation and the evidence of PROMIS software. So summarising, my research was upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen. It was the neocons. It leads to Alexander Haig, who shut down the Peter Wiedniks investigation. Paul Wolfowitz was leading the charge. Why? Because he was getting appointed as the new president of the World Bank. Danny CASOLARO was going to expose that PROMIS software was installed at the World Bank and IMF and being used to money launder weapons and drugs worldwide. That's why he turned up. That's why he took charge. My next podcast is I'll tell you who tipped off William Hamilton. He was a Pentagon spy who was investigating the evidence of the PROMIS software together with the neocons were selling arms to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein. It goes further than this. If this is not enough corruption, then you'll find out what they did when leading the charge to declare war on Iraq and raid his banks. So these are the neocons that were upset. Project Hammer, World Bank, Guggenheim Bank, Citibank, PROMIS software with Pentagon, with Echelon, CIA, DIA, NSA, NRL. Danny CASOLARO was going to investigate all those things. The last one was the CIA's PROMIS Swift banking software. He was talking directly to William Hamilton to investigate the PROMIS software. He was talking directly to Michael Riconosciuto, who had modified that PROMIS for CIA for Swift banking. But he was also talking to Chuck Hayes. I've checked all the telephone records. He was speaking to Chuck almost up to the last week. And Chuck was telling him and educating that it is, the PROMIS software was Project Hammer. It was Swift banking. What Danny didn't know, because this happens in the year 2000, is that General Urquhart, who represented the Guggenheim Bank in Washington, also worked as a senior executive with the World Bank, so here we have the World Bank, gave testimony about Project Hammer in court. And this is what triggered the RCMP investigation coming into the US for the PROMIS software that implicated Peter Wiedniks. They went to see Michael Riconosciuto. They then went to see Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Colonel Albert V. Carone, the bagman for Nuganhan Bank, BCCI, and was a made man in the Gambino Mafia, best friend of William Casey, William Colby, Michael Hand. He confirms with his testimony that Project Hammer was done with John Reed, the CEO and chairman of Citibank. That was Project Hammer. His credentials, Nuganhan Bank, and advisor to every president from Truman through to Clinton. Alternate executive director of the World Bank. He also was a special consultant to Adnan Khashoggi. So that's where Khashoggi gets involved. But that's through Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, Iran-Contra. He confirms that it operated by the Federal Reserve, Treasury, CIA, FBI, Secret Service agencies, and the proceeds are their arms, gold and drug trading activities that are done and diverted through major banks worldwide. He says that Project Hammer was to generate funds to pay off debts on bullion certificates. You have to understand this. We're talking about billions, hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars of bullion certificates issued by certain metal trusts worldwide. And they're siphoned off in order to rescue numerous major US and other international banks that by the later half of 1980s were tottering on the brink of bankruptcy. It's fraud. Earl Cockey also confirms that Project Hammer was the continuation of the operations of Nuganhan Bank. I mean, that's from him in testimony in court. He gave it 10 days, his testimony, before he died of pancreatic cancer. That's what triggered the RCMP investigation of PROMIS. It was his testimony that came in because he identified it was going through the Royal Bank of Canada and the Imperial Bank of Canada, linked to Nuganhan Bank, and with Albert V. Carone, William Casey, and William Colby. But this is the part that I want you to see that links to my story. A.B. Krongard, CIA's Project Hammer, and Banco Ambrosiano overseas, which is linked to Alexander Haig. He says that Banker Trust and Banker Trust International were involved with the St. Peter's Bank and the stolen money from Banco Ambrosiano. And that's linking back, he says, to the accounts numbers that were controlled by Lucio Jalli and Michelle Sindona. I'll do a podcast, but I've got the letters of Michelle Sindona written to President Reagan, and he's subpoenaing Alexander Haig as a witness, that he was helping him and CIA with the covert operations using his bank. He also says in 1982, Ferdinand Marcos arranged for General Fabian Ver to transfer 50 tons of gold bullion to Switzerland, shipped on aircrafts, chartered, details of who does it, and it went through Bankers Trust. A.B. Krongard was the vice chairman of Bankers Trust. He was also the director of Johns Hopkins Medicine prior to becoming the executive director of CIA. This is a testimony of General Earl Cockey, who represented Nuganhan Bank in the Washington office, served as executive director on the World Bank, and had been an advisor to all presidents up to Clinton. I also have confirmation that Robert Nichols represented 1 billion gold bullion certificates in Switzerland owned by Ferdinand Marcos. I've got the proof on that, and that's what was being laundered through Project Hammer. So that's why Robert Nichols keeps appearing for Danny, and he appeared threatening me when we're investigating this PROMIS software. But it says here, A.B. Krongard played a crucial role with Project Hammer. He says Dan Hughes caused 2 site drafts to be issued in favour of banker trusts for collateral commitment to Chase and Citibank debentures instruments, and an activity was caused General Urquhart to believe kicked off Project Hammer. So he's saying that the transaction by A.B. Krongard, director of Johns Hopkins Medicine, became executive director of CIA, number 3 man, is what kicked off Project Hammer program in a big way. The lawyers and investigators who were building the lawsuit for Dan Hughes and other clients cheated out of their money were quietly negotiating with CIA in an attempt to settle privately in and out of court. According to Dan Hughes, these negotiations were taking place within the office of Buzzy Krongard, the then number 3 man in CIA. So let's wrap up. I've been threatened. Previous podcasts show that Johns Hopkins Applied Physics was the partner of Hadron Inc. to develop the fire control command systems for the Trident submarine, the first application of PROMIS. But I was suing the directors, including A.B. Krongard, and I had a federal police investigation against him and other directors for defrauding my companies. And then I've proven that CIA Operation Still Point destroyed all my encryption businesses with United Nations and other ventures I did in Switzerland, in Geneva, with Johns Hopkins. So let's go back. Just before, the week before Robert Booth Nichols turns up, 2 programs air on TV. ABC 7:30 report about my story, and Dateline on SBS TV. What did it say? Live on TV. For months now, Johns Hopkins has been refusing to speak to Dateline, the TV program, referring all inquiries to Washington law firm Piper Rednick. Didn't reply to any of the questions. Not only that, it mentions A.B. Krongard. They defrauded me. Letters and evidence showed that it went right up to the Prime Minister of Australia. We endorsed everything they did, and they defrauded us. But this is the part that's interesting. It's where the story categorically states the university is connected to US intelligence community. Hopkins President William Brodie was appointed President George W. Bush to his Foreign Intelligence Board. So we've got him sitting up there, and I've got Stanley Schumann. And on the board of Johns Hopkins sits A.B. Krongard, Executive Director of CIA. And then they interview Wayne Masden about the fact that they destroyed my encryption companies, considering I had the root key in the Geneva bunker, and also I had a root key that we were doing for trade with China in Australia with our governments here, and confirms that US regards increased access to information as one of its chief weapons in the war on terror. They need to infiltrate or destroy root keys. And there's the evidence. I have a federal police investigation against Johns Hopkins directors for defrauding my companies. There's A.B. Krongard on the company in 2002, 2003, while they're destroying my companies in Australia and my ventures in Geneva for a root key with Johns Hopkins. 2 ventures with Johns Hopkins, and they destroy us twice. And it also says that he's represented Alex Brown and Bankers Trust. He became the chair and board of Bankers Trust and served in that capacity until joining CIA. So summarising a long journey, you can't throw dice and line all these ducks up. It's only when you look at 21 years of evidence that started with Danny Casolaro, and you look at the probability 3D, 4D with time, and collapse it down to reveal the octopus in the name of national security, how corrupt these individuals are to destroy people worldwide. But more important, it cost Danny Casolaro his life when he investigated the evidence that the PROMIS software was installed at the World Bank and IMF, and it also the testimony of Michael Riconosciuto that it was installed at Citibank, and it was also used for the fire command control systems for the Trident nuclear submarine, and it was renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government. My evidence confirms that all that evidence is true, and that's coming back from Australia, from real evidence of activities that they've done in Australia and they've done to my Australian company to validate the evidence and testimony of Michael Riconosciuto, Bill Hamilton, but also substantiate and validate that Danny Casolaro was going to Martinsburg with the evidence of the smoking gun to come back with the head of the octopus, but regrettably they were involved in everything from October Surprise, Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of the PROMIS software to infiltrate banks worldwide, to become the fox looking after the chicken coop, to launder drugs and arms worldwide.